I would like to thank Duncan very much for inviting me to be here tonight and for all of you for coming out to hear me speak. The subject I'm going to talk about is whether or not China can rise peacefully. I think that probably over the next 50 or so years, it will be the most important strategic question facing the United States, not unlike the challenge we faced during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Before I get into the meat and potatoes of my talk, I'd like to make two preliminary remarks. First of all, I am simply assuming in this talk that China will continue to rise. I think it's actually an open question what the future of the Chinese economy holds. I've been to China a number of times, and I've talked to a number of very smart and measured Chinese who think that China's long-term economic situation is not particularly rosy. I'm assuming, simply assuming, that China will continue to grow over the next 30 years in ways similar to the way it's grown over the past 30 years. Second assumption is the only way that you can answer the question of whether China can rise peacefully is with a theory. It is a theoretical question because we have virtually no facts about the future. No one knows who's going to be running the ship of state in China in the year 2025 or in the year 2030. Nobody knows who is going to be the President of the United States and what he or she is going to think. Furthermore, what we are hypothesizing here is a situation where the structure of the relationship between China and the United States and China and its neighbors changes in ways that China is much more powerful relative to everybody else then than it is now. You want to just remember, we're talking about the future here. We're not talking about now. China is a paper tiger now. We're talking about China 30 years out, 25 years out, when it is much more powerful, because we're again assuming that it's going to grow economically. And it's very important to understand that people's behavior changes differently as the structural environment that they operate in changes. For example, I often say to undergraduates to drive this point home, right now you have hardly any money to spend on entertainment, and you live a very frugal life. You behave in particular ways because of the amount of money you have in your wallet. If I wrote you a check for $15 million and said, here it is, and you can do whatever you want with it, your behavior would change in fundamentally different ways because you'd have $15 million to play around with. The structure of your personal situation would be very different. And people behave differently in different structural environments. So again, we're talking about a situation that's very different from the one we operate in now. We're talking about a situation where we don't know who's going to be running foreign policy in either the United States or China or in Japan or India, right? So we have no facts about the future. So what we need is a theory of great power politics. The theoretical question as to whether China can rise peacefully or not. Now, this brings me to my talk, which has three parts. First, I'm going to lay out for you my theory of great power politics. Second, I am then going to give you a synoptic view of American foreign policy from 1783, when we gained our independence from Britain, up until the present. And what I'm going to try and do in laying out that synoptic view of history is convince you that it is consistent with my theory. Because what I have to do is give you confidence in my theory. so you just don't think that I'm up here blowing smoke. So again, the second part of the talk is where I give you a synoptic view of how the United States behaved in the foreign policy realm over the past 200 plus years. Then the third part of my talk is I'm going to tell you how I think China will behave as it becomes economically more and more powerful. And of course, I also have to tell you how I think the Americans will respond to China. Now, what I'm going to tell you, and this is hardly surprising, is that China will imitate the United States. And both China and the United States will act according to the dictates of my theory. And when we talk about how the United States will react to China some distant future, my argument is you can figure out pretty quickly how the United States will react, not just by looking at the theory, which is part one of the story, but also by looking at the history that I laid out in the second part of the story. So what I'm saying to you is I think that all three pieces of the puzzle fit together. Again, theory, a synoptic history of American foreign policy, and then what China will do and what the United States will do down the road. And I just add, I'll also talk about China's neighbors. Okay, so let me start with the theory. I'm going to give you my theory of great power politics, and it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to understand. I start with 5 simple assumptions about the world. My first assumption is that states are the principal actors in international politics, and there is no higher authority that sits above states. In international relations theory land, we call this anarchy. Anarchy does not mean murder and mayhem. Anarchy is an ordering principle. It's the opposite of hierarchy. Anarchy means that there is no higher authority that sits above states. The United Nations, the League of Nations, forget it, right? These are bit players in international politics. States are the principal actors. They're like pool balls on a table. So it's an anarchic system. And again, anarchy does not mean murder and mayhem. It simply is the opposite of hierarchy. Second assumption is that all of the states in the system have some offensive military capability. Now, for sure, some states have more offensive capability than others. Countries like the United States, countries like Britain, countries like China, countries like Israel, they have quite a bit of offensive military capability. Other states like Jordan, Belgium, Switzerland, Guatemala, these are states that have remarkably little offensive military capability, but they have some. But all states have some offensive military capability. Third assumption, which is of enormous importance, and I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time on it because it helps drive the theory in very important ways, has to do not with capabilities. Second assumption was all about capabilities. Third assumption is about intentions. And my argument is you cannot know with a high degree of certainty what the intentions of other states are. Now, let's talk about present intentions. My argument is that it's very difficult to discern present intentions. And the reason it's so difficult to discern intentions is because intentions are embedded in human beings' heads. And you can't see them and you can't measure them. Unlike capabilities. Remember, the second assumption had to do with capabilities. All states have some offensive capabilities. Third assumption is about intentions. Capabilities are much easier to measure. Based on looking at the audience, there are a number of people here who are at least as old as me, if not older, so you remember the Cold War. Remember in the Cold War, we were really good at assessing Soviet capabilities. We could count how many armored division equivalents they had, how many SS-18s, how many carriers, how many SSBNs, and so forth and so on. Capabilities were relatively easy to measure because you could see them. Soviet intentions, we had endless debates about what Nikita Khrushchev's intentions were or what Joe Stalin's intentions were in 1945. We never settled those debates, and we still don't know what the answer is. Think about the causes of World War I. You all know we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. It'll be in 1914, August 1st, 1914, following the July crisis of 1914, 2014. We still don't know exactly what German intentions were during that crisis, and we have big debates. Intentions are very hard to discern. But if you don't believe that, and you think that there are ways you can figure out what intentions are today, my Sunday punch is you can't tell me what future intentions will be. Because you cannot tell me who will be in charge in any particular country 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And even if you can tell me who will be in charge, you can't tell me what his or her intentions will be. Let me drive this point home by giving you an example that has nothing to do with international relations, and that's divorce. Anytime two people get married, they think that the person that they are marrying is wonderful and has benign intentions towards them. And they think, in almost every case, that they're going to live happily ever after. Well, as you know, we have close to a 50% divorce rate in the United States. This means that people are often wrong in assessing the future intentions of the person they are marrying. You can never be certain. This is a very depressing thought, but nevertheless true. You can never be certain that the person that you are marrying won't turn out to be Attila the Hun. This is not to say, I want to be very clear here, this is not to say that you can be certain that you will marry Attila the Hun. It's just to say you cannot be certain. Intentions, especially future intentions of states, are very hard to know. It's 1919. You're at Versailles. You're dealing with Germany. You just fought World War I against this monster. What do you think Germany's intentions are going to be 20, 30 years down the road as you're trying to figure out how to deal with Germany? How do you think about what its intentions will be? How do you think about how to shape its intentions? You don't have the foggiest idea what its intentions will be 20, 30 years down the road. So 3 key assumptions. System is anarchic. No higher authority above states. 2, all states have some offensive capability. And 3, intentions are very hard to know, especially future intentions. 4th assumption, remember there are 5 assumptions. 4th assumption is that the highest goal of states is survival. And the reason that survival is the highest goal is because if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of the other goals. So survival has to be the number one goal. This is not to say you cannot have other goals, because of course you can. It's just that survival is number one. 5th assumption, and the final assumption, is that states are rational actors. To put it in slightly different terms, states are strategic calculators. States are reasonably good at coming up with clever strategies to maximize their prospects of survival. That's the rational actor assumption. Okay? Those are the 5 assumptions. Now you take those 5 assumptions, you put them in the blender, and you hit the on switch, and you get 3 forms of behavior. First is that states fear each other. That level of fear varies across space and time, but states tend to fear each other. And they fear each other for 2 reasons. First of all, there's always a possibility that you'll end up living in the same neighborhood as a state with a lot of offensive capability and aggressive intentions. There's a good chance, if you're living in Europe, you'll end up next door to Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany. Second reason that states fear each other is there's no higher authority to call if you get into trouble. This is what I call the 911 problem. When you dial 911 in the international system, you know who's at the other end? Nobody. It's an anarchic system. So you get very nervous at the thought that you may end up next to a very powerful state with malign intentions and in a world where there's no higher authority to turn to. And that leads to my second form of behavior. Again, the first form is fear. Second is that states quickly realize that it is a self-help system. As my mother used to say when I was a little boy, God helps those who help themselves. States figure that out very quickly. You do not want to depend on anybody else for your security unless you absolutely have to. You want to be able to take care of yourself. This, of course, leads to the third and most important form of behavior, and that is that the best way to survive in an anarchic system is to be very powerful. To put it in political science speak, to maximize your relative power. To put it in terms I learned in New York as a young boy, to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Because when you're really powerful, nobody fools around with you. How many of you go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico or Guatemala attacking the United States? Have you ever thought about that? No. Why? Because no country of that size would ever attack us. Why? Because we're Godzilla. We're so big and so powerful. If you're really big and really powerful, you survive in the international system. It's the best way to survive. Now, put it in slightly different terms, the name of the game is to be a regional hegemon in my story. Some people say that really what you want to do, John, is you want to be a global hegemon, because if you dominate the entire globe, then you're so powerful that nobody on the planet can fool around with you. My view is that's desirable in theory, but impossible in practice. First of all, the planet's too big. Secondly, there's just too much water out there. And the end result is you cannot be a global hegemon. And I believe, by the way, that the reason the United States has gotten itself into a lot of trouble since 1989 is because it's been pursuing global hegemony. And you end up tilting at windmills, in my humble opinion. What you want to do is you want to be a regional hegemon. You want to dominate your area of the globe. That's goal number one. And goal number two is to make sure that you have no peer competitor. Now, what exactly do I mean when I say you don't want a peer competitor? A peer competitor is another regional hegemon. You want to dominate your region of the world and make sure nobody else does the same thing, so that there is no other regional hegemon on the planet. And the argument that I'll develop in the second part of my talk is that the United States is the only regional hegemon in modern history. We are a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States has a deep-seated interest in making sure there is no hegemon in Asia, in Europe, or as we used to say during the Cold War, in Eurasia. Okay? Now, you're probably wondering, why is John saying that it's important that there be no hegemon in another area of the world? It's easy to understand, given the basic theory that I've laid out, why the United States should want to dominate the Western Hemisphere. But why is it important for us that no other state dominates its region of the world? It's very simple. Most of you have probably never thought much about why the United States is wandering all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in everybody's business. Right? Why are we doing this? Now, when you ask people this, they'll often say, we do it because we can. And there's a certain amount of truth in that, but that doesn't really explain why we can. The reason we can is because we are free to roam. We are free to roam. What does that mean? Because we have no security problems in our own backyard, because we are so dominant in the Western Hemisphere, we are free to roam all over the planet. And the last thing we want is a situation where a country like Germany, be it Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany, dominates Europe and is free to roam into our backyard. The last thing we want is a China that is free to roam. On the contrary, what you want is a situation where a European country or an Asian country that is very powerful has to worry about other great powers in its region. Let me just give you an example to illustrate this. As many of you know, having seen this movie, Lincoln, we fought a civil war between 1861 and 1865. The British gave a lot of thought to coming in on the side of the South. You want to know why? Because Britain wanted two Americas, or two USs, for the reason I'm laying out here. The British went to considerable lengths in the 19th century to prevent us from becoming a regional hegemon. They would have been very happy to see us split in half, have a confederacy and a union, right? But they did not intervene. And why did they not intervene? Because they were pinned down on the home front. They had to worry about the French. They had to worry about the Russians. As you know, they had this empire, and what happened in the balance of power in Europe had all sorts of implications for the empire. The British were pinned down. They were not free to roam. They were not free to come into the Western Hemisphere and interfere in our Civil War, which is exactly what I'm talking about. Again, there are enough old dogs in this room to remember the Cold War. You remember when the Soviets used to put troops in Cuba? This drove us stark raving crazy. We did not like that at all. Right? You do not want a situation where the Soviet Union is free to roam. You want one country that's free to roam, us, the United States. So, what I did here was I started with 5 assumptions. And I told you that as a result of those 5 assumptions, what you get is a world where the ideal situation for purposes of survival, ultimately a defensive goal, is to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block, or to put it in political science speak, to be a hegemon. And again, the goal is to be a regional hegemon, 1, and 2, make sure you have no peer competitor. That's my basic theory. Now, what I want to do is go to the second part of the talk, and I want to talk about American foreign policy since 1783. In 1783, when we finally gained our independence, the United States was comprised of 13 measly colonies strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. Over the next roughly 60 years, the United States expanded across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans, and we stole their land. We went to war against Mexico, and we stole what is today the southwest of the United States from them. We invaded Canada 200 years ago in 1812, and we did that in good part because we wanted to incorporate Canada into the United States. Most of you probably don't know this, but the reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the capital of Canada is because the Canadians/British expected us to pay a return visit because we had our gun sights on Canada. And the only reason we didn't move into the Caribbean and incorporate places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Jamaica into the United States was because of the slavery issue. The northern states did not want any more slave-holding states in the Union. And as you all know, the sugar industry in the Caribbean is more labor-intensive than cotton and tobacco. Therefore, you had huge numbers of slaves in the Caribbean, and you would have been incorporating more slave states into the Union had you put the march of conquest in a southerly direction. That's the only thing that stopped us from going south. We had a voracious appetite. Not only did we have a voracious appetite, we had a record of conquest that is unparalleled in modern history. It's no accident that Adolf Hitler greatly admired us. In the fall of 1941, when the Wehrmacht was crashing into the Soviet Union, Hitler repeatedly referred to America's creation of Lebensraum. He referred to the Volga River as his Mississippi. He said, these are people who know how to create Lebensraum. They've provided us with a historical justification for what we plan to do in the Soviet Union. The United States is an incredibly ruthless country, and it was created in an incredibly ruthless way, despite the fact that this is hardly ever told to us in textbooks or classes growing up. That's how the United States was created. But that was only part of the game. That's manifest destiny. There was a second part of the game, and that's the Monroe Doctrine. The fact of the matter is we had these European great powers in the Western Hemisphere. As I told you before, the British thought long and hard about interfering in the American Civil War. Well, we had to get rid of them. And old President James Monroe told the Europeans in 1823, effectively, that we are not now powerful to throw you out of the hemisphere, but we will eventually reach that point. We'll throw you out, and after we throw you out, you're not welcome back. This is our hemisphere, we run it, and you stay out once we get you out. That's the Monroe Doctrine, 1823. In the wake of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Spanish were thrown out, and that was the end of the story for the Europeans. We had established regional hegemony. We had carved out a huge country that went from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We had settled our differences in the Civil War, and then, of course, we populated that country with the hyphenated American immigrant groups from Europe: Germans, Irish, Jews, Italians, and Poles. Right? And then throughout the Europeans. So by 1900, the United States was a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. And since then, no country has been in a position to challenge us. Now, as I told you, establishing hegemony is the first goal. The second goal is to make sure that you have no peer competitor. There were 4 potential peer competitors in the 20th century. Fortunately, during the 19th century, when the United States was just coming together and consolidating its position in the Western Hemisphere, there was no potential peer competitor in either Europe or in Asia, because the French, who stopped making babies after 1815 in large numbers, were going down, and the Germans, who were making babies in large numbers — remember, German Americans, the largest ethnic group to ever come to the United States, and we all know how much trouble those Germans caused in World War I and World War II. They're making lots of babies, right? But they really don't become a problem until the early 1900s. Remember, there is no Germany until 1870. Bismarck becomes Prussian Chancellor in 1862. There are wars in 1864, 66. Then the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. That's when you get Germany, 1870. And then, of course, they continue making babies, and they're making steel and chemicals and so forth and so on as well. So it's in the early part of the 20th century where they are a potential hegemon. Last potential hegemon in Europe before Imperial Germany was Napoleonic France, 1792 to 1815. So we really caught good luck over that period from 1815 to 1914. But in the 20th century, 4 peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. As you all well know, we played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. We entered World War I in April 1917, when it looked like Germany might win the war, and we helped finish off Germany. World War II, we played the key role in defeating Imperial Japan. In fact, we almost single-handedly defeated Imperial Japan. And we played a key role, not the key role, in defeating Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union, fortunately, played the key role in defeating Nazi Germany. And I say fortunately because whoever played the key role in defeating Nazi Germany would pay an incredible blood price. And better it be them than us, the Soviets, that is. Not that I have anything against the Soviets, but as a good old-fashioned American, I prefer to see them have to pay that price rather than us. But anyway, we played a key role, not the key role, defeating Nazi Germany. And then, of course, the Soviet Union was our principal concern during the Cold War, as many of us in this room remember. And the United States played the key role in containing the Soviet Union and then ushering it down the toilet bowl when the time came. And shortly after Cold War was over with, the Bush administration — this is President George H.W. Bush administration — had some defense guidance that was leaked that made it very clear that our policy was to be the most powerful state on the planet forever, and to make sure that there were no peer competitors out there. And my argument is that this has long been American policy. The name of the game in the international system is, again, to be a regional hegemon, which the United States became in 1900, and two, to make sure you have no peer competitors, i.e. to make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. I think that story is consistent with my basic theory. Third part of my talk, China. How is China likely to behave? Well, my argument is that China is going to imitate the United States. First of all, let's talk about the balance of power in Asia. If you're China, don't you want to have a situation where you have very weak neighbors? If you're China, do you want a powerful Japan in your neighborhood, or do you want a weak Japan? Are you happy about the fact that China's going to have more 80-year-olds than 8-year-olds at the rate it's going? Or would you prefer to see them grow significantly from a population and from an economic point of view? If you have a choice, one is where China is 20 times more powerful than Japan, or one where Japan is 2 times more powerful than China. Do you think it doesn't matter to the Chinese? You don't think the Chinese care about how powerful their neighbors are? Of course, we care. But you don't think they're going to care? They're going to care. They care greatly. They want to be really powerful. And they want to be very powerful because they remember what happened between 1850 and 1950 when they were not very powerful. It was not a pretty story. The Europeans, the Americans, with the open door policy, and especially the Japanese, took advantage of them and did terrible things to them. That's what often happens. Not always, but it often happens in international politics when you're weak. You don't want to be weak in international politics because other states may try to push you around, and again, there's no 911. So you want to be really powerful in your neighborhood. If we dominate the Western Hemisphere, don't you think China's going to want to dominate Asia? What about the Monroe Doctrine? You don't think China's going to have a Monroe Doctrine of its own? You don't think China's going to want to push the Americans out? You think it's okay for us to have a Monroe Doctrine? It's okay for us to have a Monroe Doctrine and go ballistic when the Soviets put troops in Cuba. But it's okay for us to have aircraft carriers and fighter planes running up and down the Chinese coast, going into the Taiwan Straits. This shouldn't bother them at all. They shouldn't want a Monroe Doctrine of their own. It's not the way world politics works. If any one of you were in Beijing, you'd want a Monroe Doctrine, and you'd want to push those Americans as far away as you possibly could. You'd be foolish not to. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So you could expect the Chinese to begin to try and push us out beyond the first island chain as they get more and more powerful. You could expect them to want to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere, because it's the best way to survive in international politics. You don't want the United States in your backyard. Remember what I told you in the beginning. We don't want China in our backyard. We don't want anybody in our backyard. I fully understand that. But again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Okay. So I think the Chinese are going to try and dominate Asia. And I would note, you could even begin to see the inklings of that. Okay? Then the question is, what is the United States going to do? Well, the historical record is very clear here. We are not going to let them dominate Asia, not without putting up a real fight. And again, the point I tried to make to you is that the United States is a very nasty country. The idea that we're some sort of benevolent liberal hegemon is good for the masses, but it's not the way the United States of America works, right? All you have to do is look at the historical record. Right? We're not going to go gently in the night. And the Chinese, by the way, understand this fully. One of the reasons I'm always received so well in China is because the Chinese say, finally, an American who speaks honestly about how the United States operates in the international system. They're so used to all these liberal gabbers coming over and talking about human rights and international institutions and peace, love, and dope, and then watching the United States behave in very aggressive ways. They say, this is ridiculous, right? Let's get somebody who can tell it like it is. We're not going to go gently into the night, so we're going to put up a fight. Well, that's to say, we're going to try and contain China. And we're going to do it with the help of China's neighbors. China's neighbors are already very nervous about China. As many of you know, the Vietnamese, the Singaporeese, the Japanese, the Indians are all nervous. They are all going to be key players in the balancing coalition. You're going to have a balancing coalition against China, not altogether unlike the balancing coalition that you had against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, what makes this an especially difficult problem is two things. One is what's called the security dilemma in international relations theory. You're probably saying, what is this security dilemma? The security dilemma says that whatever one country does to defend itself invariably looks offensive to the other side. So, the United States announced last year, 2011, that we were going to have a pivot to Asia. Now, this was done, from our perspective, largely for defensive reasons. But if you're sitting in Beijing and you see the United States Navy and Air Force pivoting to Asia, it does not look defensive. It looks offensive. To put this in slightly different terms, I said to you, what we're going to do is we're going to contain the Soviet Union, right? Well, we're going to contain China. It may look like containment from our point of view, but from their point of view, it looks like encirclement. If you're in Germany in 1912 and you see the triple entente, France, Russia, and England coming together, you're in Berlin, that looks like encirclement. If you're in Moscow, or you're in London, or you're in Paris, it looks like containment. This is the security dilemma. Of course, anything that China does to defend itself will be interpreted by the United States as offensive in nature. The Pentagon is not far from here. The Pentagon is filled with people who are experts in threat inflation. And anything that the Chinese do to defend themselves will be portrayed in the most negative light. They will be portrayed as a real serious threat to their neighbors and to the United States, no matter what they do. Again, this is the security dilemma. So the first problem that we face here is that there's almost nothing they can do or we can do in this security competition that doesn't exacerbate the problem because it looks offensive in nature to the other side. Second big problem we face is there are a number of flashpoints in Asia that are very scary. Taiwan is one. I actually have a number of realist friends. These are realist friends who think we should basically abandon Taiwan because our relationship with Taiwan is so potentially dangerous, right, that we could end up in a shooting war with China as a result of that relationship. I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just saying real flashpoint. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you in the room, have been following the goings-on regarding the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. Very, very scary. I mean, the potential for trouble there is great. South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, I could go on and on. There are potential flashpoints here that make this a very dangerous situation, especially since a number of those potential crises points involve operations at sea, where people might think the risks of escalation are not great and the collateral damage will be small. So it's a potentially very dangerous situation. So my argument is that given the basic structure of the international system, right, and the incentives that China will have to dominate Asia and push us out, and the incentives that we will have to prevent them from becoming a peer competitor, you have the makings of a very dangerous situation as China continues to rise. Now, let me conclude by saying that I said in the beginning that whether or not you think China can rise is largely a theoretical question. And the analysis that I tried to give you here tonight is based on my theory of great power politics. However, it's very important for you to understand that the theories that we have in international politics are crude devices. And they are sometimes wrong. My gut instinct is that a really good theory, and I think I have a really good theory, is right at best 3 out of every 4 times. And it's wrong 1 out of every 4 times. There's no such thing as a foolproof theory in social science. The world is simply too complicated. Okay? So my theory, which I, as you would expect, think is a good theory, is going to be wrong 25% of the time. Given the story that I have told you tonight, let's hope that my theory is wrong in this case. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do questions. We have a few rules on questions as always, and we have a full house tonight. So number 1 is please wait for the microphone because, again, we do record this thing and we want everybody in the room to hear your question, as well as we'd like the folks who watch this online to hear it. The other thing is do please state your name and your affiliation. No acronyms, please. So CNA becomes Center for Naval Analysis. Whatever. You only get 1 question because we do have a full house tonight. And we know everybody likes to put their question in context, but you got to keep that context short. First question.
Hi, Sean Davis, Booz Allen Hamilton. So you said your theory might be wrong 25% of the time. How might it be wrong in this case? What are some plausible scenarios in the wrong case?
Well, there are alternative theories that tell a different story, and I'll tell you 2 of them. One is economic interdependence theory, and the argument is that both China and the United States and China's neighbors as well are hooked on global capitalism. These are highly interdependent economies. Everybody is getting richer, and nobody in their right mind would kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Okay? So when I go to China and I give this talk, I would say I've given this talk in China maybe 30 times, maybe even 40 times. The most common argument that's used against me is the argument that economic interdependence will foster peace, and therefore you'll be proved wrong. That's one argument. I don't think that's a good argument, a very good argument against me, and I think I can knock that one down. I think the more powerful argument against me, which most people don't use, is that given the presence of nuclear weapons and given the power of nationalism, it is very difficult for a country like China to become a hegemon in Asia, and it will be easy for the United States to contain China. And therefore, the security competition that sets in will be at a very low level, not particularly dangerous, and it will be relatively easy to moderate that security competition. So it's nuclear weapons and nationalism. Now, if you're really sophisticated, what you do is take all 3 arguments and marry them together: the economic interdependence, the nuclear argument, and the nationalism argument, and use those arguments against me. But I think if I'm proved wrong, as best I can tell, those are the strongest arguments against me.
Dan Mintz, that's a small consulting company. Could you talk a little bit about India in this context? That how likely is it that India could be successfully the counterweight, this competition back and forth to prevent China? And what are that implications in terms of U.S. policy to India in terms of helping that along or not helping that along?
Couple points on this. First of all, it is important to understand that although India has now as many people as China, in fact, it's surpassed China in population, and its population is growing at a more rapid clip than China's. India is not likely to end up in the same economic class as China. And the main reason is the human capital in India is not equal to the human capital in China. And that's because of the very high levels of illiteracy in India. So India will be an important player in the game, but India is not going to rival China. That's point number one. Point number two, there is no question that India is going to be an important player in the balancing coalition and an important ally of the United States. I often say to students, why is it that the United States and India are such good friends today? And of course, in typical American fashion, they say it's because both countries are liberal democracies. And I say that can't be the answer because both countries were liberal democracies during the Cold War, and we didn't like each other at all during the Cold War. Something changed. What changed is the Soviet Union went away, and the Indians see China looming on the horizon. And the Indians are very fearful of China. Third point, India and China have two potential, let's call them zones of conflict. One is the border dispute between them, which they fought a war over in the early 1960s. And in fact, the Chinese clobbered the Indians in the early 1960s. You know, the main reason India has nuclear weapons is because of China. The main reason Pakistan has nuclear weapons is because of India. Of course, the main reason China had nuclear weapons is because of the Soviet Union. And the main reason the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons is because of us. But be that as it may. Point is, the Indians worry greatly about that border conflict with China. Okay? The second reason that the Indians worry about the Chinese is that everybody understands that from China's perspective, there's sort of two main theaters of potential conflict with the United States. One is the Asia-Pacific region, which is the Western Pacific. The other is the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. And this is because the Chinese, as they grow economically, are likely to develop a powerful navy and think about coming into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea to get to the Middle East. This is their blue water navy threat, which is not present now, but people worry about. Well, if they come through the Straits of Malacca or they come through Indonesia, the various straits in Indonesia, and into the Indian Ocean, we're talking about the Chinese here, right? India is going to care greatly about the fact that the Chinese Navy is in the Indian Ocean. And if the Chinese have a naval base in Pakistan, this will, of course, drive the Indians crazy. So the Indians are very concerned about the Chinese, not simply because of the border dispute, but because of the SLOCs that go from the Asia-Pacific region into the Middle East.
Rudy Lohmeyer, A.T. Kearney Global Business Policy Council, former student. Great to see you again. What is the role, this is a theory question for you, can't wait to hear your answer. What is the role of diplomacy in your theory? And just one sentence of context, Joe Nye, Richard Armitage, and the construct of soft power, how do you interpret it? What role does it, or more traditional definitions of diplomacy, play in your theory?
Yeah, this is a great question. I am a structural realist. And as a structural realist, I believe that the structure of the international system provides leaders with remarkably little maneuver room. And the title of my book is on great power politics, where the theory that I enunciated tonight is laid out. The title of the book is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And for me, the international system presents all these tragic situations where states, in effect, get trapped by these structural forces into competing in ways that often have disastrous outcomes. And there's really no way out of this, let's call it iron cage, okay? If you were to talk to, let's say, Henry Kissinger, or you were to talk to my good friend and co-author Steve Walt, they would say, the problem with John is he's too deterministic. He's too much of a structuralist, and he does not leave enough room for diplomacy. So someone like Henry Kissinger would say, I believe, that if Otto von Bismarck or Henry Kissinger were running American foreign policy over the next 20 years, they could negotiate through these obstacle-ridden waters, and we could avoid disaster quite easily. Quite easily. Not easily, but quite easily, okay? Steve Walt, right, who teaches at the Kennedy School, where they basically teach students, right, how to solve problems, how to deal with tricky issues, how to come up with clever solutions, is much more inclined to think that there are ways to solve these problems, right? This is Steve's view. And he would say, and he has said to me, John, your problem is you're just too deterministic. You don't leave enough room for diplomacy. So I am answering your question by saying diplomacy has very little room in my theory, which is why I didn't go to it in response to this gentleman's first question, right? And this is not to say that I wouldn't rather have a smart realist like Bismarck or Kissinger in charge rather than someone like Don Rumsfeld. But in the final analysis, I just don't think it matters very much.
Wong Kim Min, studying Arab Studies in Georgetown University. I'm from the region you call Flashpoint, South Korea. And I have a question about what you think of the North Korean regime's future and how China and the United States might react to its abrupt change or a potential collapse.
Yeah, excellent questions. I think the North Korean regime has a very bright future. And the main reason is that I believe China will go to enormous lengths to make sure that North Korea remains intact. North Korea is a buffer zone for China between South Korea and the Chinese mainland. And South Korea is joined at the hip with the United States. As you well know, the United States has military forces stationed in South Korea. If North Korea were to collapse and the South Koreans were to cross the 38th parallel and go north and create a unified Korea, again, under the auspices of South Korea, that would be a state that was closely allied to the United States that was now sitting on the Yalu River. The last time the United States crossed the 38th parallel was in 1950. And we headed up towards the Yalu River. And everybody knows what happened. The Chinese came in, and we ended up fighting the Chinese from 1950 to 1953 because the Chinese made it perfectly clear that there was no way they were going to tolerate the United States occupying North Korea and sitting on their doorstep. This is realism 101. I do not believe that situation has changed at all. So I believe, from China's point of view, it is important that North Korea survive. And I would bet that if you could get behind closed doors in Beijing, you would find that the Chinese leaders are not all that upset about the fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons. Because as long as North Korea has nuclear weapons, the United States and the South Koreans will be remarkably reluctant to cross that 38th parallel. And that is in China's interest. Having said all that, I do think that there is a possibility that the North will melt down and that the South will try to unify Korea. And I think if that unlikely but nevertheless plausible scenario occurs, it will be extremely dangerous. And I just hope the U.S. government and the government in Beijing has talked about what they're going to do and what we're going to do in this situation. Because driving American forces or South Korean forces across the 38th parallel is really tickling the dragon.
Hi, John. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. In listening to your structure, which I think is amazingly rigid, and the truth of the matter is things keep changing. And the question is, at what point, and also, what does it mean in terms of how the military, and I would argue the State Department should plan? I mean, our budgets go in 5-year lumps. I'm just, everything keeps changing. We don't live in this static world. And personalities and leadership, I believe, make a real difference. And I would argue that today we have a real void of leadership on a worldwide basis.
Okay. Let me just say a few words about what has changed and what has not changed. In a way, I agree with you completely, and in a way, I disagree with you fundamentally. First, let me start with the disagreement. We have long-standing battles over these issues, Mitzi and I. Years. I have many bullet holes in my body from having dealt with Mitzi. I say that with warm regard for her. No, what I would argue has not changed is the basic structure of the system. It's still anarchic. It's still hard to assess intentions. Survival's still the principal goal, okay? So the basic essence of international politics has not changed. I think in 1989, you remember Frank Fukuyama's very famous article, The End of History. Frank was arguing in that piece that the essence of international politics had changed and that John was basically a dinosaur, okay? I obviously disagreed then and disagree now, okay? But where I do agree almost completely with you is when you say that the world is incredibly dynamic and so much change is taking place all the time. And the rise of China is a perfect example of that, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, you remember in the mid-1980s when we used to talk about these issues, nobody or hardly anybody foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union 4 or 5 years later. So there is quite a bit of rapid change in the system. And by the way, again, remember, I was assuming that China will continue to grow. It may very well be the case that the Chinese economy will flatline. The U.S. economy will continue to recover. And if that's the case, we will be more powerful. I could give you this argument, but I won't. We will be more powerful relative to everybody else in the year 2050 than we are now, right? There's only one country on the planet that can give us a run for our money, and it's China, right? You all understand that the power gap between us and our three principal rivals from the 20th century, Japan, Germany, and Russia, is going to widen significantly because all three of those countries are depopulating. And we're not depopulating, right? So China is the only country out there, and we don't know for sure where it's headed. And therefore, it could change direction in ways that I don't anticipate. So I agree with you on that point. Now, the question is, how do we think about force structure? How do we think about Pentagon planning? And this opens up a whole can of worms, but let me just say a few words about it. No, it's very important. There are three areas of the world that we care about for strategic purposes, really care about. Europe, Northeast Asia, or East Asia, Northeast Asia really, and the Gulf. And we care about Europe and Northeast Asia because that's where other great powers are. And we care about the Gulf because that's where oil is. In my opinion, those are the three areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere that are worth fighting and dying for. Okay? Throughout my lifetime, Europe has been by far the most important area of the world for the United States. You want to remember that it was the Japanese who attacked us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Fortunately, Hitler declared war against us 4 days later on December 11th, 1941. But he did not attack us at Pearl Harbor. He did not declare war until 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, we went into the war and fought the war with a Europe first strategy. We're very clear on this. And the reason that we had a Europe first strategy was because Europe was the most important place on the planet for us outside of the Western Hemisphere, and Nazi Germany was a much greater threat than Imperial Japan. And the Cold War, as we all know, was very Eurocentric. There are people in this audience, Phil, I'm sure, who remember the swing strategy, when we used to run war games and swing all those forces out of Asia to Europe in a conflict between the United States, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, because Europe was the central location of the Soviet threat. What is now happening is that Europe, for the first time in our history, is going from being the most important area of the world to being the third most important area of the world. I often say to students, when you have a swing strategy and you swing to a particular area, that means you're swinging away from somewhere else. And the question is, where are we swinging away from? And we're going to swing away from Europe. This brings me to my second point. I used to think, foolishly, that the Persian Gulf, or the Middle East more broadly, and Asia were two separate theaters, right? And you sort of had a choice. I used to say, let's stop fighting ground wars in the Middle East, the greater Middle East, and concentrate on the Chinese threat in the Asia-Pacific region. What I've come to understand is that those two areas are inextricably bound up. And this gets to my response to this gentleman's question about India. Remember, I talked about how if the Chinese develop a blue water navy, they'll come through the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, to the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf is going to remain an area of enormous strategic significance for the United States because it's going to be inextricably bound up with the interests of China, the interests of India, right? And the area that's going to suffer is Europe. Now, in terms of force structure, my view is you should put a lot more assets into the Air Force and the Navy, and you should put fewer assets into the Army. I feel somewhat guilty saying this as a West Point graduate. Nevertheless, if you're a cold-blooded strategist like me, you got to say to yourself which areas of the world matter and which kind of forces are most important for dealing with potential threats in those regions of the world. And I think that probably you want to put more assets into the Air Force and the Navy and fewer assets into the ground forces. And I would reinforce this point by saying, I don't know how many of you know this, I was adamantly opposed to the Iraq War. And I think the idea of fighting wars in what we used to call the third world or the developing world is sheer lunacy. And therefore, I have very little interest in maintaining a significant army that can engage in counterinsurgency. I'd much rather spend that money on building infrastructure in the United States and improving the schools in the city of Chicago than fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. But if I'm going to spend it on defense, I'd much rather spend the money on the Navy and on the Air Force and dealing with the China problem than dealing with counterinsurgency. Sorry for taking so long on that question, but it was an excellent question.
Hi, I'm Elliot Hurwitz. I'm retired. And my question is, at the moment, given all the economic uncertainties, at the moment the U.S. military is declining in value, and the Chinese military is increasing in size and power. I believe the Chinese have a naval base in Pakistan already, and it's right near the Strait of Malacca. So what does this suggest to you?
I think the Chinese naval base that you're referring to is Gwadar, which is in Pakistan, which is pretty far from the Straits of Malacca. I think the Chinese military capability is growing, but that's because it's starting from a very low base. And I think they have remarkably little power projection capability into the Indian Ocean and into the Arabian Sea. The point that I tried to make here, and I hope I was clear to you folks on this, is that the threat that I'm positing is 20, 25 years down the road. I believe, as I said early on, that China today is a paper tiger, right? The Chinese would be remarkably foolish to pick a fight with the United States, especially outside of the Western Pacific. And even there, they'd be foolish to pick a fight with us. So I think the fact that their defense budget is increasing and their military capabilities are now increasing is, at the moment, not a significant issue. I think it will be over the long term if they continue to grow economically, okay? With regard to the United States, my view on the United States is that we basically shot ourselves in the foot by going into Iraq and fighting these remarkably costly wars. And one of the reasons that we're in so much trouble today is because of these foolish ground wars, our penchant for counterinsurgency. So my advice to the United States would be to, pick your battles more wisely and spend your money more wisely. But the most important thing for us, when all's said and done, the two things that matter most are population size and wealth. Everything else, superstructure, military forces. The key to making America great was immigration. Immigration is what made this country great. Almost everybody in this room, I'm sure, can trace their descendants back to Europe or Asia or Latin America, right? Immigration is what has allowed us to grow and grow and grow. And we've also had reasonably high birth rates over time. And the end result is we have lots of people. And secondly, we are a remarkably wealthy country because people get educated here and they do very well for themselves. And it's a rich country as well as a big country. And those are the two key building blocks. So what really concerns me is, number one, the fact that our economy is in trouble, and I worry that we won't pull out of this tailspin we've been in, although I think we will in the end. And secondly, that we continue to grow the population and that we don't have a population. Those are the two things that matter most. And I want to say one word on China. Remember, China's had lots of people for a long time, and we really didn't worry about China. The reason we worry about China now, as I just said, is because not only do they have lots of people, they now look like they're going to have lots of wealth. And it's that combination of a large population and lots of wealth that makes us very nervous. This raises the question. I often ask audiences this question. I say you have two choices. One is the Chinese economy can continue to grow economically, which will be good for the American economy. Or two, the Chinese economy can flatline, which will be bad for the American economy and the international economy more generally. Which would you like to see happen? You have a choice. You can play God. Those are your two options. If you're talking to an audience filled with business people, right, they want to see the economy grow because it will make America richer, and them richer, right? But as a good realist, I would be very pleased if the Chinese economy flatlined. The last thing I want to do is see China become really powerful economically. Because once China is really powerful economically, it can cause all sorts of problems for us. Business people will say, that's not going to happen. And they say it's not going to happen. It gets back to my answer to the gentleman behind you at first question, because of economic interdependence. People in the business world believe that this is not a zero-sum game, John. Everybody wins. Let's just keep trading. Who cares if the Chinese get richer, get more powerful? They're not going to start a war because Who would kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? This is the basic rhetoric. My response to them is, okay, let's allow China to grow economically into a juggernaut. But I want to ask you one question, Mr. or Ms. Business Person. Can you tell me what Chinese intentions will be once they become a Goliath? The answer, of course, is no. And if you can't tell me what the intentions of that Goliath will be, I do not want to help that country become a Goliath, as long as I cannot know its intentions.
My name is Pete McGann. I'm retired. One of the things that strikes me when you talk about an emerging China and a strategy of being able to meet them in the Pacific and retain our control of the sea is the law of the sea treaty. Shouldn't we be ratifying that?
I think the answer is yes, and as best I can tell from my limited studies of the issue, both the business community and the U.S. military think that we should ratify the treaty. So I don't think that the law of the sea treaty would stand, ratifying the law of the sea treaty would stand in the way of anything that I have set up here.
Tyler Gibson with the Wilson Center. My question is, since you've said that Europe is now going from number 1 to number 3 and we're going to be swinging away from Western Europe, do you think that leaves an opening for our former Cold War rival, Russia, that supplies a lot of energy to Europe, to exert more influence on that region of the globe?
No. I think Russia is a country that is in deep trouble and has a very grim future. And there is hardly any chance that Russia would achieve domination over the eastern half of Europe, much less the entire continent. That threat has just gone away. I think the most significant problem that we would face if we pulled everything out of Europe is what would happen to the Germans. The Germans would no longer have the American nuclear umbrella over their heads. The United States would no longer be providing security for Germany, and the Germans would be on their own. You know, the European Union recently got the Nobel Prize for causing peace in Europe. This was a major mistake on the part of the Nobel Committee. The Nobel Prize should have been given to NATO, and what NATO really is a euphemism for American control of Europe. When the Cold War ended, I wrote what was then a very famous article called "Why We Will Soon Miss the Cold War." And I projected in this article that attracted an enormous amount of attention and gained me many enemies, that if the Soviet Union pulled out of Eastern Europe and the United States pulled out of Western Europe, that you would go back to the future, that security competition would set in, and there would be lots of trouble in Europe, as there historically had been. Now, many people will come up to me today and say, "Hey, buddy, you were proved wrong." And I say to them, I was not proved wrong, because my argument was you had to take the Soviets out of the East and the Americans out of the West. And we did not take the Americans out of Western Europe. We kept the Americans in Europe. And in fact, as I'm sure almost of you noticed, we moved NATO eastward to cover those areas that the Soviets had abandoned. What we were doing was we were expanding the realm covered by the American pacifier. The United States, because it's so powerful and because it sits on top of Europe, maintains the peace in that region. Why do you think we didn't pull our troops out of Europe? Well, why do we keep troops in Europe? There is not a single European leader who has asked us to leave since 1989. This is really quite remarkable. Not a single European leader has asked us to leave. And in fact, the Europeans are actually quite nervous that we might leave because of the reordering of our priorities that I just described to you. The Europeans are well aware that we're going to pivot away from Europe and pivot to Asia. They're very nervous. They want us to stay. Why do they want us to stay? Because they understand full well you take away the American pacifier and then the security situation in Europe looks very different, especially because of the Germans. So it's really the Germans more than the Russians that make everybody very nervous.
My name is Avi. I'm in the U.S. Navy. One point of clarification on your third assumption on intentions. Where does an intention originate? Is it with an individual, a state, or in a structure? Does it come out of the structure?
Well, my starting assumption is that intentions are in the heads of the individuals who run a particular state. So again, if you're looking at the Soviet Union, it's Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, can be Malenkov, the people who run a country. If you're looking at the United States today and you want to know what its intentions are vis-a-vis Syria, you would have to look at Barack Obama, obviously, but you'd be concerned about what Hillary Clinton thought and a handful of other key policymakers. That would be the best way to assess intentions. So it is the individuals. However, and this is very important, and it's picked up in his rhetoric, what I eventually say is because you cannot be certain about individuals' intentions, the name of the game is to therefore maximize your power, right? So in a funny way, the structure of the situation pushes you to have aggressive intentions of your own. Do you follow that? So I start with the individual, and I start with uncertainty about intentions. But then when I take those intentions and put them in the blender and hit the on switch, then the structure takes over, and the structure says that states are going to have malign intentions. So in a funny way, what I'm saying is because we can't know intentions, that means that ultimately the Chinese are going to have malign intentions. This is my view of the United States. The United States is basically a brutal actor in international politics. My argument is the structure of the system just doesn't leave you much choice. And as I pointed out to the gentleman in the rear, there are others who disagree with me and think there's a lot more maneuver room. But
host of questions that come up, but one thing that always has me confused is this word power. It suddenly sounds like all this military ships that China will have. By the way, I'm Hank Gaffney from CNA. And then you just said it's all about wealth and a lot of people. Now, I always knew power was ships, tanks, missiles, fighter aircraft. Well, which is it? And the second question, is China going to have a social safety net, the kind that we're trying to dismantle now? And I've watched Europe. And basically, the growth of social safety nets competes with military power.
yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. I'll define power second, but just on the social safety net. I'll tell you what I think, but do be aware that this is not my area of expertise. I think, based on numerous conversations with China experts and with people inside China, that they do not have a safety net, and that it is a huge problem because they have an aging population. Japan has the most rapidly aging population in the world, but the Chinese are not far behind. And this is a manifestation of the one-child policy. And many people in China will say to you that the difference between Japan and China is that Japan got rich before it got old, whereas China is getting old before it gets rich. And this is just another way of putting Hank's question about the social safety net, that there is going to be a huge social safety net in Japan. And of course, there is a significant social safety net in the United States, Social Security, right? And that is not present in China, right? And because of the one-child policy where one child has to support two parents, we have an age pyramid that looks like this. This is going to cause significant problems. And his point, his very last point, if my memory is correct, is that there is something of a trade-off between spending on defense and spending on Social Security or welfare. I think that's absolutely right. And your point, or the implication of your point, is that they're probably going to have to spend a lot of money on social welfare that otherwise would go to defense. I think that's true. And by the way, let me just say, when I go to China, there are three arguments that are used against me. One is the interdependence argument. That's the most popular argument. The second argument is what I call the Confucian argument. This is the argument that China's a Confucian society. They're into peace, love, and dope, and they never start trouble, and therefore they can rise peacefully. It's the flip side of American exceptionalism, right? We never cause any trouble. It's everybody else. This is China never causes any trouble. But the third argument you hear in China, which I have found surprising over time, is that China is not going to grow the way I'm assuming it will. And it's for these kinds of reasons. So there are a good number of Chinese, I don't know whether they're right or wrong, who are simpatico with the basic logic of your position, right? And again, I consider that good because I don't want to see China continue to rise. And by the way, I really love going to China, and I love the Chinese people, so I'm not hostile to China in any meaningful way. China, I find China to be a more congenial intellectual environment than the United States. I'm more at home in China intellectually than I am in the United States, because there are lots of realists in China, right? And not many liberals. So when I speak in China, I often will address an audience like this by saying, it's good to be back among my people. And everybody, of course, looks at me like, who is this guy? Because obviously I'm culturally on another planet. I can't even recognize my own name in Chinese. But I'm very sympathetic, and I have nothing but warm and friendly relations towards the Chinese. Another reason we should hope that my theory is wrong. Now, let me just say a few words about power. First of all, power is one of the most difficult concepts to define, and most IR scholars don't even bother to try to define it in any meaningful way. I, on the other hand, have a definition, which I'll lay out in 2 seconds. But I just want to say, you want to remember that there's no such thing as a right or wrong definition. Definitions are just definitions. The question is how useful they are, not whether they're right or wrong. So I'm not telling you my definition is right. I just find it to be quite useful. Very simply, I distinguish between latent power and manifest power. Latent or potential power is all about, and this is my response to Elliot, latent power is all about population size and wealth. Manifest power is all about military power. And there, I think it's mainly the conventional forces that you have. How many armored division equivalents, how many Navy attack submarines, and so forth and so on. But that would be my distinction.
Hi, Charlie Hankin from C. Hankin and Associates. This is the second time I think I've heard you here, and so I'm able to integrate a couple of things with that.
I hope I didn't change my story.
No. It's remarkably consistent. I want to draw a thread around 2 points. You've partially answered in Hank's case, but 2 threads. The first is survival is a key attribute or a key behavior, and the best way to survive, well, in the Chinese context, without getting too deep, is in the Chinese context, survival is closely linked to being able to offer the masses the prospect of increasing, if not radically increasing, economic well-being, bring them in from the farm to the cities and give these people a life. And if they don't provide that, then the survival of the communist regime is very much at risk, and they know that. So there's a tension between survival in regional hegemonic terms on the one hand and internal economic well-being on the other hand. In the Chinese case,
think about the Soviet Union, right?
Right.
Which collapsed from within.
Right.
Supports your point.
Right. And then the second point is the cultural point. You alluded to it. You don't have to be a Confucianist, but I mean, the cultural point in the Chinese context, it seems to me, is radically different than it is certainly in the U.S. case, okay, with a manifest destiny went across the continent and then expansion overseas, whereas in the Chinese case, there hasn't been that much interest in expansion overseas. So if you draw a little story around the survival can be economically driven and the culture is not outwardly expansionist, maybe it's not quite so bad. It's different in the Chinese case.
Yeah. On your first point about states collapsing from within, I agree with you completely. Of course, that's not what I meant by survival. And those are just two different forms of survival, right? And I was talking about survival in the context of the competition among great powers, which is not to say the other form is not important. Witness the Soviet Union. On your second point, a very interesting point, what you're saying to me is, John, I think culture is more important than you make it out to be. And by the way, if you read Henry Kissinger's recent book on China, there's a lot of that in there. He sees cultural differences between the Americans and the Chinese. And by the way, occasionally when I go to Asia, people will say, John, you have a very Western view of international politics. And this is Asia. Okay. Now, my response to that is, first of all, as I just told you, I am much more at home intellectually in China than I am in the United States. And as I said to you before you asked your question, it's because I find that the Chinese love realism. By the way, the Chinese are they're the biggest lovers of IR theory I have ever come across. It's amazing how much the Chinese love IR theory. And they love realism, which is not to say everybody's a realist, but there are just many more realists per capita there than there are here, right? And I do not find much evidence at all of a Chinese mindset that is non-Western. And I've talked to some pretty high-level people in China and sat there for an hour and a half talking about basic strategic issues involving the South China Sea and so forth and so on. And I do not have any sense whatsoever that I'm dealing with people who think about international politics in ways that are different than me. I just don't see it at all. And I would just say to you, I'd like to see the literature, right, that supports your viewpoint and go over it very carefully. I'm not saying I'm right. I've been wrong on, I hate to say it, more than a few issues over the course of my lifetime. You may be right on this one. But all my experience says these people are just like us. By the way, the other example, the Japanese, right? If you look at Japanese behavior between the Meiji Restoration in 1945 when they got crushed by us, the Japanese behaved just like the European great powers did. They consciously imitated us, right? And I, again, think the same is true with regard to the Chinese. But
my name is Sen Gupta. I'm with Development Equity Associates. It's a small consulting company. I was wondering if you would like to share your thoughts on an issue that I think might be relevant to what we've been discussing. And that is the issue of taxes and tributaries. Historically, empires have fallen and risen mostly based on the efficiency and the effectiveness of how well they collected taxes and tribute from their the regions that they dominated. And a lot of the hegemony we talk about has been related to aggrandizement which originates from the collection of tributary and taxes. And so in your model that you've described, how do you see this issue fitting in?
I think that for the traditional European empires, what you say is true. I mean, if you think about the British Empire, if you think about the British in India, the British in East Africa, right, there's no question that they were paying lots of money to administer these places, but at the same time they were collecting taxes and tribute and so forth and so on. And I think, however, the United States is not an empire in that sense. It's not a good old-fashioned European empire like the British Empire or the Ottoman Empire or even the French Empire. And therefore, I find those categories sort of hard to get my hands around. I mean, there's no question that we pay a substantial amount of money to keep troops in Europe, and we pay a substantial amount of money to keep troops in Asia, right? But it's not an empire in the sense that Britain was an empire, right? And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not the United States is wealthy enough to sustain some significant overseas military commitments without bankrupting itself. And as I said before in response to one of the questions, I think the United States is wealthy enough that it can do all sorts of things around the world, provided it doesn't overreach. And remember, I made the point that I think the United States got itself into a lot of trouble because it got interested in global hegemony. I think this is what the Bush Doctrine was all about. And once you start to think that you can use military force to reorder the world at the end of a rifle barrel, you're going to get yourself in all sorts of trouble. And we did in the greater Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so forth and so on. But Europe, you know, the argument for staying in Europe is it's relatively cheap, we can afford it, and we keep the peace in Europe, if you buy John's American pacifier argument. So I don't think we are an old-fashioned empire, and therefore running into the kinds of problems that Britain did. And I don't think that we're bankrupting ourselves by having some significant overseas commitments. But I do think you have to manage these things carefully, otherwise you will end up bankrupting yourself.
Good evening, sir. I'm Richard Dorn. I'm with the Navy Air Warfare here in the Pentagon, and I'm also the Navy selectee to the Tufts Fletcher School currently. My question, sir, is you talked earlier about rising global powers looking to imitate. Even in your book, you talk about innovation. In China, we're seeing an industry dedicated to cyber infiltration, cyber warfare. Do you see that playing a significant role in China's strategy, perhaps their grand strategy of keeping the U.S. out and being very effective as a force multiplier or a timeline enhancer for their wealth, leading to military ultimate strength?
Yeah, in my book, I make the argument that states often imitate other states. When somebody does something that produces success, others imitate. But also, as you point out, I argue that states try to innovate, come up with clever ways, new ways of getting advantage over other states. And it's quite clear that what's taking place in the area of cyber war, which is what you were focusing on, is something of an arms race where they and us are going to great lengths to develop capabilities to get a leg up on the other side, should it be necessary to try and use some sort of get some sort of coercive leverage over the other side. So I think there's an abundance of evidence that the Chinese are going down this road and they're trying to get a leg up on us. The question you have to ask yourself is, will they ultimately succeed? And my answer to that is no, because we will go to enormous lengths to checkmate them at every point. And I don't think they have any inherent advantage over us. And truth be told, I don't think we have any inherent advantage over them. So I think this will be something like a stalemate.
So does that say NSA is not worth all that money?
No, I said it's a competition. And if you're in a competition like that, you want to keep up with the other side. And of course, we'll constantly be seeking to gain advantage. That's the name of the game. That's the innovation part of it, right? But my only point to this gentleman was I'm not too sure that either they or us is going to gain a significant advantage. You know, one of the real problems that you run into when you are arms racing with a serious competitor is that it's hard to develop capabilities that the other side won't match almost immediately. And this is why when you get into a war with a country like Imperial Germany or Nazi Germany, it's almost impossible to come up with a clever strategy or a magic weapon that produces a decisive victory. And what you end up doing is standing toe-to-toe and slugging it out. And then the last one standing is the winner. You follow what I'm saying? And I think that as China continues to grow economically and translates that economic might into military might, given all their human capital, given all their wealth, they'll be able to keep up with the United States. And it'll be hard for us, let me put it differently, it'll be increasingly hard for us over time to come up with clever ways to best them. And it'll be very difficult for them to come up with clever ways to best us. And so we'll be relatively evenly matched. I think the best thing that you can do when you arms race with another state is hope that that state decides to fight wars in the developing world. I've told the Chinese on a number of occasions since I first went there in 2003 that if they were smart, what they'd tell the United States is that the United States has to stay in Afghanistan and in Iraq until they win both of those wars. And that the Chinese should tell us that I'm speaking as someone who's Chinese, we're counting on you Americans to win the war on terror. We think the war on terror really matters. You're out there doing God's work, and we want you to continue doing it. So please stay in Iraq and in Afghanistan forever. And that, from China's point of view, is manna from heaven, right? I remember during the Cold War in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, most of my friends, maybe even some people in this room, were aghast. Oh my God, the Pentagon over here was blowing gaskets. This was, the end of the world. The Soviets are on the march. They're in Afghanistan. The threat has been underestimated. My view was exactly the opposite. This is wonderful news. Soviets went in Afghanistan. Could you ask for a better outcome if you're arms racing with the Soviet Union? Go into Vietnam? You want to go into Vietnam? Okay? De Gaulle told us, 64, 65. He said, don't go in there. We've been in there. We did that. It does not end happily. We went in. It did not end happily, as almost everybody in this room remembers. Then the Chinese foolishly went in there in 1979. And you know what happened to them? They got their snouts whacked. Go into Vietnam, go into Afghanistan. You understand we're going to lose the war in Afghanistan. This is just gone, over, done with. It's just a question of when we get out. Right? So what you want to do if you're arms racing to get a leg up on the on the Chinese, is you want to hope that they decide to go into places like Afghanistan and Vietnam, right, or wherever, and get bogged down, because that causes untold trouble.